you will spend the rest of your natural life in prison. You will never be free." 13-year-old Zachary Mitchell's confident smirk finally faded from his face as Judge Raymond Foster delivered a sentence that shattered the teenager's certainty that his age would shield him from serious consequences. Throughout the 3-week trial for the brutal murder of his 8-year-old neighbor, Sophia Chen, Zachary had maintained an unsettling demeanor of amusement and confidence, smiling during victim impact statements, making jokes with his attorneys during testimony about the child's death, and even winking at reporters in the courtroom gallery. The 13-year-old had become convinced, whether through misunderstanding of juvenile justice or genuine delusion about his own invincibility, that a child his age simply couldn't receive a serious punishment regardless of the crime committed. What Zachary Mitchell failed to understand was that Georgia law permitted even the youngest offenders to be tried as adults for the most heinous crimes, and that his own behavior in court would seal his fate more effectively than any prosecutor's argument. Before we continue with this deeply disturbing case, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from as we explore this tragic case of childhood violence, prosecutorial discretion in juvenile cases, and a young killer's catastrophic miscalculation about the consequences of his actions. The small town of Pinehurst, Georgia, population approximately 12,000, represented the kind of close-knit Southern community where neighbors knew each other by name, where children played freely in yards without constant supervision, and where violent crime was so rare that the local police department had gone nearly 15 years without investigating a homicide. Located in rural Dooley County, approximately 90 miles south of Atlanta, Pinehurst was characterized by agricultural land, modest single-family homes, a downtown area consisting primarily of a post office and a handful of small businesses, and a sense of safety that would be permanently shattered on the afternoon of March 14, 2023. The town's residents were predominantly working-class families, many employed in agriculture, light manufacturing, or commuting to larger nearby cities for work. The community placed high value on church attendance, family bonds, and the kind of informal social support networks where neighbors helped each other during difficult times and celebrated together during joyous occasions. Pinehurst Elementary School served kindergarten through 5th grade, while older students were bused to the consolidated middle and high schools in the county seat. It was a place where most residents believed they knew everyone's business, where secrets were difficult to keep, and where the idea that a child could commit murder was simply incomprehensible. Sophia Marie Chen was 8 years old when her life was taken on March 14, 2023. Born to Robert and Lynn Chen, who had met while both were teaching English in South Korea and had eventually settled in Pinehurst to be near Robert's extended family. Sophia represented the joyful collision of two cultures and the promise of a generation more open and connected than those before. With her father's Southern warmth and her mother's Korean heritage informing her upbringing, Sophia had grown into a bright, creative child whose personality filled rooms and whose laughter was described by neighbors as infectious. At Pinehurst Elementary School, where she was in 3rd grade, Sophia excelled particularly in art and creative writing. Her teacher, Mrs. Dorothy Palmer, a 30-year veteran of the Dooley County school system, would later describe Sophia as one of those rare students who made teaching feel like privilege rather than work. Sophia's artwork, colorful and imaginative, decorated the classroom walls and her family's refrigerator in equal measure. She had recently won second place in a county-wide poetry contest with a piece about her grandmother in Seoul, demonstrating writing ability well beyond her years. Beyond academics, Sophia was a child of simple pleasures and generous spirit. She spent hours creating elaborate scenarios for her collection of stuffed animals, assigning them personalities and relationships that she would explain in great detail to anyone willing to listen. She loved helping her mother in the garden, where they grew vegetables and flowers that Lynn had known in Korea, alongside southern staples like tomatoes and okra. She was learning to play piano, practicing diligently despite finding scales boring, because she loved the feeling of making music. She saved her allowance to buy toys for the annual Christmas toy drive at her church, insisting that other children needed them more than she did. Sophia's parents, Robert and Lynn, had built a life in Pinehurst that honored both of their backgrounds while creating something uniquely their own. Robert taught history at Dooley County High School, known for bringing the subject alive through storytelling and his genuine enthusiasm for helping students understand connections between past and present. Lynn worked as a nurse at the county hospital, her calm competence and gentle bedside manner making her a favorite among patients who often requested her specifically when they needed care. The Chen family lived in a modest ranch-style home on Maple Street, a quiet residential road where houses sat on large lots with mature trees and well-kept lawns. Their immediate neighbors included the Morrison family with 3 teenage daughters, the elderly widow Mrs. Sarah Thompson, who had lived on Maple Street for 50 years, and the Mitchell family whose son Zachary would destroy the community's peace and take Sophia's life in an act of violence so senseless that investigators would struggle to find any rational motive. What made Sophia's murder particularly tragic beyond the obvious horror of a child's death was the timing. The Chen family had been planning to relocate to Atlanta at the end of the school year, with Robert having accepted a position at a prestigious private school, and Lynn having been offered a nursing position at Emory Hospital. They had been excited about expanded opportunities for Sophia, particularly access to programs for gifted students and cultural resources celebrating her Korean heritage. The family had been counting down the months until their move, never imagining that Sophia would not live to see it. In the weeks before her death, Sophia had been particularly excited about an upcoming school talent show where she planned to perform a piano piece she had been practicing. Her piano teacher, Mrs. Gloria Henderson, later told investigators that Sophia had been working on Clair de Lune by Debussy, an ambitious choice for an 8-year-old, but one that Sophia had been determined to master. Mrs. Henderson recalled their final lesson, just 2 days before Sophia's murder, where the little girl had played through the entire piece with only minor mistakes, beaming with pride when her teacher praised her progress. Sophia's journal, a purple notebook with stickers covering the front that she had received for Christmas, provided a window into her thoughts in the weeks before her death. Entries revealed typical childhood concerns, mixed with unusual maturity and kindness. She wrote about looking forward to the talent show, about missing her grandmother in Korea, about a classmate who had been mean to her, but whom she had decided to forgive because maybe she's having a hard time at home and taking it out on others. One entry from March 10th, 4 days before her murder, read, "Mom said we have to be nice to everyone because you never know what they're going through. I try to remember that when people aren't nice to me. Maybe if I'm extra nice to them, it will help them feel better." This philosophy of kindness and empathy, instilled by her parents and reflected in her daily actions, made the brutality of her death even more incomprehensible. Sophia Chen had approached the world with openness and generosity, seeing the best in people, never imagining that evil could exist in someone so close to her own age. Zachary James Mitchell was 13 years old when he murdered Sophia Chen. Though his behavior and psychological profile suggested a level of dysfunction and callousness far beyond what would typically be expected even from a troubled adolescent. The only child of Dennis and Karen Mitchell, Zachary had grown up in a household characterized by chaos, inconsistent discipline, substance abuse, and exposure to violence that had profoundly shaped his development in ways his parents either didn't recognize or chose to ignore. Dennis Mitchell worked sporadically in construction, his employment unstable due to a combination of economic factors and personal issues, including untreated alcoholism. Karen Mitchell had worked various service industry jobs over the years, but had been unemployed for the past 18 months, reportedly due to chronic pain issues for which she received disability payments and prescription medications that she supplemented with pills obtained through less legitimate means. The Mitchell household existed in a state of perpetual dysfunction, with neighbors reporting frequent loud arguments, police calls for domestic disturbances, and periods where the family seemed to disappear for days at a time. Zachary's early childhood, documented through school records and Department of Family and Children Services reports, had been marked by instability and concerning behavior from a young age. Preschool teachers had noted his difficulty with emotional regulation, his tendency toward aggressive play, and his apparent lack of empathy when other children were hurt or upset. These early warning signs had prompted recommendations for evaluation and intervention. But the Mitchells had either refused services or had failed to follow through with recommended treatments. By elementary school, Zachary's behavioral problems had escalated. He had been suspended multiple times for fighting, for threatening other students, and for disturbing incidents involving harm to small animals during recess. School counselors had documented concerns about possible conduct disorder, had recommended psychiatric evaluation, and had even filed reports with DFCS when Zachary came to school with unexplained bruises and when he made statements suggesting he was witnessing domestic violence at home. However, DFCS investigations had been inconclusive. The Mitchells had been defensive and uncooperative, and the interventions attempted had been minimal and ineffective. Teachers described Zachary as intelligent but unmotivated, capable of grade-level work when he chose to apply himself, but often disruptive and defiant in class. He had few friends, with most students avoiding him after incidents where his play became too aggressive, or where he said things that made others uncomfortable. One particularly concerning incident from 5th grade involved Zachary bringing detailed drawings to school depicting violent scenes, including what appeared to be children being hurt by older figures. When questioned about these drawings by the school counselor, Zachary had claimed they were just from my imagination, and had refused to elaborate. By the time Zachary reached 7th grade at Dooley County Middle School, he had gained a reputation as someone to avoid. Students described him as creepy and mean, reporting that he would stare at younger children in unsettling ways, that he made inappropriate comments with sexual overtones despite his young age, and that he seemed to enjoy making others uncomfortable or afraid. Teachers noted that Zachary showed no remorse when disciplined, often smirking or laughing when being reprimanded for misbehavior. What would later emerge during investigation was that Zachary had been engaging in increasingly concerning behaviors at home that his parents had either failed to notice or had chosen to ignore. He had been caught multiple times torturing insects and small animals, creating elaborate methods of causing suffering that suggested planning and premeditation rather than impulsive cruelty. He had been accessing violent and sexually explicit content online, with his browser history revealing searches that would alarm investigators when they eventually examined his digital footprint. He had been stealing items from neighbors' homes, taking personal objects that seemed to have no monetary value, but that perhaps represented trophies or means of feeling power over others. Most disturbingly, Zachary had been observed by neighbors watching younger children in the neighborhood in ways that made adults uncomfortable. Multiple residents of Maple Street would later report to investigators that they had noticed Zachary paying particular attention to Sophia Chen, watching her play in her yard, following her at a distance when she walked to the school bus stop, and finding excuses to be outside when she was outside. These observations, dismissed at the time as perhaps awkward adolescent behavior or coincidence, would take on horrifying significance after Sophia's murder. The relationship between Zachary Mitchell and Sophia Chen, if it could be called a relationship at all, was entirely one-sided. Sophia had been aware of Zachary primarily as the older kid who lives down the street, someone she would wave to politely when they encountered each other but with whom she had no meaningful interaction. Zachary's interest in Sophia, as investigators would later piece together from witness statements and evidence, appeared to have been predatory from its inception, viewing the younger child as a potential victim rather than a person. The afternoon of March 14, 2023, began as a typical Tuesday in Pinehurst. The weather was mild, with temperatures in the low 70s and partly cloudy skies, creating pleasant conditions for outdoor activity. Sophia Chen had attended school that day, participating normally in her classes and showing no signs of distress or unusual behavior. Her teacher, Mrs. Palmer, would later recall that Sophia had been excited during art class, working on a watercolor painting of flowers to give to her mother for an upcoming birthday. The school day ended at 3:15 p.m., and Sophia rode the bus home as usual, getting off at the Maple Street stop at approximately 3:42 p.m. Her mother, Lynn Chen, was working the evening shift at the hospital and would not be home until after 11 p.m. Her father, Robert Chen, was still at the high school where he sponsored an after-school debate club that met until 5:00 p.m. on Tuesdays. This schedule, routine and unremarkable, meant that Sophia would be home alone for approximately 90 minutes between getting off the bus and her father's arrival home. The Chens had established careful protocols for these afternoons when Sophia was home alone. She was to go directly inside, lock the door, call her father to confirm she was home safely, complete her homework, and occupy herself with approved activities until her father arrived. She was not to answer the door for anyone, was not to go outside, and was to call her father immediately if anything unusual occurred, or if she felt unsafe for any reason. Sophia had proven herself responsible in following these rules over the several months since Lynn had begun working evening shifts, and her parents had felt confident in the arrangement. On March 14th, Sophia followed the established protocol initially. Security camera footage from the Morrison family's doorbell camera, which had a partial view of the Chen driveway, showed Sophia getting off the bus at 3:42 p.m. and walking directly to her front door. Phone records confirmed that she called her father at 3:44 p.m., a brief call lasting 37 seconds, during which Robert Chen later testified she sounded normal and happy, reporting that she had a good day at school and confirming she was safely inside with the door locked. What occurred over the next 67 minutes would be reconstructed through a combination of physical evidence, digital forensics, witness statements, and eventually Zachary Mitchell's own inconsistent accounts. At some point between 3:44 p.m. and 4:51 p.m., Sophia Chen's afternoon of homework and piano practice was interrupted by Zachary Mitchell, who gained entry to the Chen home through methods that would become crucial evidence in establishing premeditation. The first indication that something was wrong came at 5:03 p.m. when Robert Chen arrived home from school, earlier than expected, because the debate club meeting had been cut short due to several students having conflicts. He immediately noticed that the front door, which should have been locked, was standing partially open. Calling Sophia's name as he entered, receiving no response, Robert felt immediate alarm as he moved through the house searching for his daughter. What Robert Chen discovered in Sophia's bedroom would haunt him for the rest of his life and would transform a quiet Georgia community's understanding of evil. Sophia's body was on her bed, positioned in a way that suggested she had been arranged post-mortem. She had been strangled, with ligature marks on her neck indicating a cord or rope had been used. She had been sexually assaulted, with evidence suggesting the attack had occurred while she was still alive. The bedroom showed signs of disturbance, with furniture moved and items knocked over, but also evidence of staging, with certain objects deliberately positioned in ways that investigators would later determine were intended to mislead, or perhaps to satisfy some psychological need of the perpetrator. Robert's 911 call, placed at 5:07 p.m., captured the raw anguish of a parent discovering their child murdered. His voice, initially controlled as he reported finding Sophia's body, quickly dissolved into anguished screams that the dispatcher struggled to understand. "My daughter. She's not breathing. Oh God. There's blood. Someone hurt her. Someone was in our house. Please send help. Please, Sophia, baby, please." The dispatcher kept Robert on the line while simultaneously dispatching emergency services, attempting to determine if Sophia could be saved while also gathering information about what Robert was seeing. Pinehurst Police Department officers arrived at the Chen residence at 5:14 p.m., with Chief Michael Peterson and Officer Amanda Rodriguez being first on scene. Chief Peterson, who had served in law enforcement for 28 years but had never investigated a child murder, immediately recognized that they were dealing with a crime scene of extreme brutality and potential sexual nature. He secured the residence, requested additional resources from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, and attempted to comfort Robert Chen while preventing him from disturbing evidence in his daughter's bedroom. The investigation that unfolded over the next 72 hours would combine traditional police work with sophisticated forensic analysis, ultimately creating an overwhelming case against Zachary Mitchell. The crime scene investigation, conducted by a joint team from local police and GBI specialists, revealed extensive physical evidence that would tell much of the story of what had occurred in the Chen home that afternoon. The point of entry was determined to be a window in Sophia's bedroom that had been pried open from outside, with tool marks on the window frame matching a screwdriver later found in Zachary Mitchell's bedroom. This discovery was significant because it demonstrated that the perpetrator had not been invited inside, had not been let in by Sophia, but had broken in deliberately, suggesting premeditation rather than impulsive action during a chance encounter. Inside Sophia's bedroom, investigators documented a scene of extreme violence. The ligature used to strangle her was identified as an electrical cord from a lamp in her room, indicating the killer had used materials at hand rather than bringing a weapon. However, the sexual assault had been committed using an object also taken from Sophia's room, suggesting opportunistic escalation of violence once inside. The positioning of Sophia's body and the arrangement of items around her suggested the killer had spent time in the room after death, possibly engaging in what forensic psychologists would later describe as post-offense behavior, indicating a need for control and power. The most crucial physical evidence came from biological samples collected during the autopsy and crime scene processing. DNA evidence under Sophia's fingernails, where she had apparently scratched her attacker during the assault, would later match Zachary Mitchell's DNA profile. Semen collected during the sexual assault examination, despite Zachary's young age, contained DNA matching his profile. Fingerprints found on the window frame, on items in Sophia's bedroom, and on the lamp whose cord had been used as a ligature all matched Zachary's prints. Beyond physical evidence, digital forensics would provide a disturbing window into Zachary's mindset before and after the murder. His laptop, computer, and phone, seized during execution of a search warrant, revealed extensive searches in the weeks leading up to Sophia's death. The search history showed queries about how to get into locked houses, do kids go to jail for murder, how long does DNA last, and, most disturbingly, how to hurt kids without them screaming. More horrifying were images found on Zachary's phone taken on the afternoon of March 14th after Sophia's murder. The images, which would be shown to the jury during trial only in redacted form due to their disturbing nature, showed Sophia's body in her bedroom, photographed from multiple angles. The metadata on these images, including timestamps and location data, conclusively placed Zachary at the crime scene during the window when the murder occurred. Even more damning, Zachary had sent one of these images via text message to himself, apparently as a way of preserving it, even if his phone was examined, demonstrating consciousness of guilt and awareness that his actions would have investigative consequences. The investigation of Zachary Mitchell as a suspect began within hours of Sophia's body being discovered. Chief Peterson, conducting a canvass of the neighborhood to identify potential witnesses or security camera footage, spoke with multiple residents of Maple Street who mentioned that Zachary Mitchell had been seen outside at unusual times, watching the Chen house and exhibiting behavior they found concerning. Mrs. Sarah Thompson, the elderly widow who lived between the Chen and Mitchell homes, told investigators that she had seen Zachary leaving his house around 3:30 p.m. on March 14th, walking toward the wooded area behind the houses rather than toward the street or bus stop. Based on these initial statements, and on Zachary's history of concerning behavior documented in school records, Chief Peterson requested permission from the Mitchell parents to speak with their son. Dennis and Karen Mitchell, who had been at home drinking for most of the afternoon according to their own later statements, agreed to let police speak with Zachary without requesting an attorney, either because they believed their son had nothing to hide or because they were too impaired to recognize the seriousness of the situation. The initial interview with Zachary Mitchell, conducted at the Mitchell residence on the evening of March 14th with his parents present, revealed a teenager who appeared remarkably composed and unconcerned, given that his young neighbor had just been murdered. Chief Peterson began by asking Zachary about his activities that afternoon, a standard question designed to establish timeline and alibi. Zachary's response, delivered with unsettling confidence, was that he had been home all afternoon playing video games in his room and had not seen or heard anything unusual. When asked if he had been outside at all, Zachary initially denied leaving his house. Confronted with Mrs. Thompson's statement that she had seen him outside around 3:30 p.m., Zachary modified his story, claiming he had briefly gone outside to look for his cat, but had immediately returned inside. Asked about the cat's name and how long it had been missing, Zachary fumbled, ultimately admitting he didn't actually have a cat, and he had just been walking around for a few minutes. This initial interview, recorded on Chief Peterson's body camera, would later be presented at trial as evidence of Zachary's immediate consciousness of guilt and his instinctive response to lie when questioned by authority. The video showed Zachary displaying no emotional response to news of Sophia's death, no shock or sadness, no concern about a neighbor child being murdered. Instead, he appeared primarily focused on establishing that he had not been involved, adjusting his story as it was challenged, and maintaining a demeanor that Chief Peterson would later describe as more consistent with someone caught skipping school than someone being questioned about a child's murder in their neighborhood. Based on this initial interview, the inconsistencies in Zachary's account, and the growing physical evidence connecting him to the crime scene, Chief Peterson obtained a warrant for Zachary's arrest approximately 36 hours after Sophia's body was discovered. The arrest took place at the Mitchell residence on the morning of March 16, 2023, with Zachary being taken into custody without incident despite his mother's hysterical protests that he's just a baby and that police were making a terrible mistake. The formal interrogation of Zachary Mitchell took place later that same day at the Pinehurst Police Department, with Zachary's parents present as required by law, given his age but with no attorney present, despite being advised of their right to request one. This interrogation, conducted by GBI Special Agent Patricia Simmons, who specialized in crimes against children, would provide crucial evidence about Zachary's mindset, his understanding of his actions, and his complete lack of remorse. Agent Simmons began the interrogation by building rapport, asking Zachary about his interests, his school, his family, attempting to create an environment where he might feel comfortable speaking openly. Zachary, perhaps believing his youth would protect him or perhaps enjoying the attention, responded readily to these initial questions. He described his favorite video games, complained about teachers he disliked, and generally presented himself as a typical teenager dealing with typical concerns. When Agent Simmons transitioned to questions about Sophia Chen, Zachary's demeanor shifted slightly, becoming more guarded but also oddly excited, as if he relished the opportunity to discuss his crime without admitting culpability. Asked what he thought about Sophia, Zachary described her as annoying and always acting like she's better than everyone. Asked to elaborate, Zachary claimed that Sophia showed off and that her parents thought they were better than everyone in the neighborhood. These characterizations, which did not match anyone else's description of Sophia or her family, suggested that Zachary had constructed a justifying narrative in which his victim deserved what happened to her. Agent Simmons recognized this as a common pattern in offenders who struggle to accept responsibility for their actions, externalizing blame and focusing on perceived flaws in their victims. As the interrogation progressed, Agent Simmons presented evidence of Zachary's involvement piece by piece, carefully observing his reactions and creating opportunities for him to provide explanations if innocent interpretations existed. She showed him the images of tool marks on the window frame, asking if he had any idea what might have caused them. Zachary suggested maybe somebody tried to break in. Asked if he owned a screwdriver or if his father had tools, Zachary confirmed they had tools in the garage, but claimed he never used them. Agent Simmons then revealed that investigators had found a screwdriver in Zachary's bedroom that matched the tool marks. Zachary's response was to shrug and say, "Lots of screwdrivers probably look the same." When informed that the specific tool marks indicated a flathead screwdriver with a distinctive damaged tip, and that the screwdriver in his room had exactly that damage pattern, Zachary's confidence faltered slightly, but he maintained that he didn't know how the screwdriver got in his room, or how it might have been used on the Chen's window. The breakthrough in the interrogation came when Agent Simmons revealed the existence of the photographs on Zachary's phone. She explained that investigators had examined his phone, had found images taken inside Sophia's bedroom, and that these images were time-stamped to March 14th afternoon. She asked Zachary directly how he could explain having pictures of Sophia's bedroom taken on the day she died if he had never been in her house. The interrogation video captured Zachary's response, which would later be played for the jury during trial. Rather than displaying shock, confusion, or panic that would be expected from someone falsely accused, Zachary smiled. It was a brief expression, quickly suppressed, but unmistakable on the video. Then, rather than denying knowledge of the photos, Zachary asked a question that revealed his fundamental miscalculation about the legal system. So, what if I was in her room? I'm 13. they can't do anything to me anyway. This statement, reflecting Zachary's genuine belief that his age would shield him from serious consequences regardless of what he had done, represented the central delusion that would characterize his behavior throughout the legal process. Agent Simmons, recognizing that Zachary had essentially admitted to being present at the crime scene, proceeded carefully. "Zachary, why don't you tell me what happened? Help me understand how you ended up in Sophia's room." What followed was a confession remarkable for its lack of remorse, its focus on Zachary's own feelings and desires, and its complete absence of empathy for Sophia, or recognition that he had done something morally wrong beyond perhaps getting caught. According to Zachary's account, he had been watching Sophia for weeks, had known her schedule, and had decided on March 14th that he was going to see what her room looked like inside. He described using the screwdriver to pry open her bedroom window, climbing inside while she was in another part of the house and waiting for her to come to her bedroom. When she did, she was surprised to see him and had told him to leave. According to Zachary, he didn't want to leave yet, and when Sophia started to yell, he had to make her stop. His description of strangling her was clinical and detached, focused on mechanics rather than the horror of taking a child's life. He described her fighting, scratching at him, eventually stopping moving. When Agent Simmons asked about the sexual assault, Zachary's response demonstrated the depths of his dysfunction. He claimed he had seen stuff online and wanted to try it. Asked if he understood that what he was describing was rape, Zachary shrugged and responded, "I guess, but she was already dead, so it's not like it hurt her." This statement, reflecting a complete absence of moral understanding beyond avoiding immediate consequences, would later be characterized by prosecutors as evidence of a sophisticated capacity for evil incompatible with claims of childlike innocence. The confession continued with Zachary describing taking photographs because he wanted to remember what it looked like, arranging Sophia's body because it looked better that way, and leaving through the window he had entered. He described going home, deleting the photos from his phone, not realizing they remained recoverable, and playing video games while waiting to see if anyone would figure out what happened. When asked how he felt about killing Sophia, Zachary's response was chilling in its honesty. "I don't really feel bad. She was going to tell on me anyway, so I would have gotten in trouble either way." This confession, obtained with parents present and properly documented, would become the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Combined with the overwhelming physical evidence, it created a situation where Zachary's guilt was essentially beyond dispute. The only remaining questions were about charging decisions, jurisdiction, and sentencing questions that would dominate the legal proceedings to follow. The decision to charge Zachary Mitchell as an adult, despite being only 13 years old at the time of Sophia's murder, came after extensive consultation between Dooley County District Attorney Catherine Williams, Georgia Bureau of Investigation officials, and juvenile justice authorities. Georgia law permitted juveniles as young as 13 to be tried as adults for certain serious felonies, including murder. But such decisions required careful consideration of multiple factors, including the nature of the offense, the sophistication demonstrated by the defendant's prior history, and the interests of justice and public safety. In Zachary's case, several factors supported adult prosecution. The premeditation demonstrated by his surveillance of Sophia, his research about breaking into homes, and his bringing tools to facilitate entry all suggested planning inconsistent with impulsive juvenile behavior. The extreme nature of the violence, including sexual assault and the taking of trophy photographs, indicated a level of depravity that raised serious questions about rehabilitation potential within the juvenile system. Zachary's confession, with its focus on avoiding consequences rather than moral wrongness, suggested he viewed the legal system as an obstacle to outsmart, rather than a mechanism for accountability and growth. Most significantly, the psychological evaluation ordered by the court revealed a profile consistent with conduct disorder with callous unemotional traits, a diagnosis that in adults would approximate psychopathy. Dr. Richard Morrison, the forensic psychologist who evaluated Zachary over multiple sessions, determined that he demonstrated significantly impaired empathy, lack of guilt or remorse, shallow emotional responses, and a manipulative interpersonal style focused on achieving his own goals without regard for others' well-being. The subject presents with character features that suggest limited capacity for the kind of emotional and moral development typically expected from juvenile rehabilitation programs. Dr. Morrison's evaluation stated, "While chronologically 13 years old, the subject demonstrates a level of instrumental violence, planning capacity, and lack of conscience more typically associated with adult offenders. The prognosis for meaningful rehabilitation within a juvenile justice framework is poor, and the risk of reoffense if released at majority age is assessed as high." Based on these factors, D.A. Williams filed a motion to transfer Zachary Mitchell's case from juvenile court to Superior Court, where he would be tried as an adult. The transfer hearing, held in April 2023, allowed Judge Raymond Foster to consider testimony from experts, review evidence, and determine whether adult prosecution was appropriate. During this hearing, Zachary's behavior provided perhaps the most compelling evidence supporting transfer. Defense attorney Marcus Webb, a public defender with extensive juvenile justice experience, argued that Zachary's age and developmental stage required keeping the case in juvenile court, where rehabilitation could be prioritized. Webb presented testimony from a defense psychologist who suggested that with intensive treatment, Zachary might develop empathy and moral reasoning over time. The defense emphasized that adult prosecution essentially gave up on a child, treating him as irredeemable before his brain had even finished developing. Prosecutor Williams countered with the brutality of the crime, the premeditation evident in Zachary's actions, and the compelling evidence that he understood exactly what he was doing and simply didn't care. She presented Dr. Morrison's evaluation and argued that protecting public safety required treating this case with the seriousness it deserved, regardless of the defendant's chronological age. The testimony that most influenced Judge Foster's decision came from Zachary himself. The judge, wanting to assess the defendant's current state of mind and capacity for understanding, had ordered that Zachary be present for portions of the transfer hearing. Zachary's demeanor throughout the proceeding was troublingly inappropriate. He appeared bored during serious testimony, smiled at times when evidence of his crime was being discussed, and at one point was observed drawing cartoon figures on a legal pad while the prosecutor described Sophia's injuries. When Judge Foster directly addressed Zachary, asking if he understood the seriousness of the proceedings and whether he wanted to say anything to the court, Zachary's response sealed his fate. "I understand this is important," Zachary said, his tone suggesting he was reciting something he'd been told to say, rather than expressing genuine comprehension. "But I also think people are making too big a deal about this. I mean, I'm 13. What are you really going to do to me? Send me to juvie until I'm 17 and then I get out? That's not that bad." This statement, reflecting Zachary's fundamental misunderstanding of the legal system and his genuine belief that his age made him essentially untouchable, demonstrated to Judge Foster that the defendant possessed neither the remorse nor the capacity for rehabilitation that would justify juvenile court jurisdiction. On May 2, 2023, Judge Foster granted the motion to transfer, ruling that Zachary Mitchell would be tried as an adult for malice murder, felony murder, aggravated child molestation, and burglary. The transfer order included findings that would later be referenced repeatedly during trial and sentencing. Judge Foster wrote, "The court finds that the defendant, despite his chronological age, demonstrated significant sophistication in planning and executing this offense. The defendant's complete lack of remorse, his instrumental view of violence as a means to an end, and his apparent belief that his age will shield him from meaningful consequences all suggest that he poses a serious threat to public safety that cannot adequately be addressed within the juvenile justice system. The interests of justice require that this case proceed in Superior Court, where the full range of sentencing options is available." The arraignment in Superior Court took place on May 15, 2023, with Zachary Mitchell entering a plea of not guilty to all charges. His behavior during the arraignment provided an early indication of what would become a consistent pattern throughout the legal proceedings. Rather than appearing appropriately serious or fearful, Zachary seemed almost amused by the formality of the proceedings. He smiled at the judge when asked to confirm his name, appeared to be suppressing laughter when the charges were read aloud, and whispered comments to his attorney that prompted multiple warnings from the bench about proper courtroom decorum. Judge Foster, who would preside over the trial, addressed Zachary directly about his demeanor. "Mr. Mitchell, these proceedings will determine whether you spend the rest of your life in prison. I suggest you treat them with appropriate gravity. Your behavior is being observed and noted, and I assure you it will not help your case." Zachary's response was to nod and say, "Okay," but his expression suggested he didn't take the warning seriously, apparently still convinced that nothing truly bad could happen to someone his age. The months between arraignment and trial, during which Zachary was held without bond at a juvenile detention facility due to his age despite being charged as an adult, provided additional evidence of his disturbing psychology. Staff reports from the detention facility documented multiple concerning incidents. Zachary had been caught attempting to manipulate younger detainees, trying to establish dominance through threats and intimidation. He had shown no interest in educational programming or therapy, dismissing both as pointless and for people who actually care about getting better. Most troublingly, Zachary had been overheard making comments to other detainees about his case that suggested he viewed his crime as an accomplishment, rather than something to regret. One staff report documented him telling another youth, "I did what I wanted, and now everyone knows my name. That's more than most people can say." Another report noted him laughing while watching a news report about his case on television in the common area, saying, "They make me sound like a monster, but at least I'm famous." These incidents, documented in official facility reports, would later be presented during trial as evidence of Zachary's consciousness of guilt and his complete absence of remorse. They painted a picture of a defendant who, far from being a child deserving of leniency and rehabilitation opportunities, was a calculating individual who viewed his crime through the lens of personal benefit rather than moral wrongness. The trial of State of Georgia versus Zachary Mitchell began on August 14, 2023, in Dooley County Superior Court. The case had attracted significant media attention throughout Georgia and had garnered national coverage due to the extreme youth of the defendant, the brutal nature of the crime, and the question of whether a 13-year-old should be tried as an adult for murder. The courthouse in Vienna, Georgia, the county seat, implemented enhanced security measures to manage the crowds of media, legal observers, and community members who sought to attend the proceedings. Jury selection proved challenging, with potential jurors expressing discomfort with the idea of potentially sending a 13-year-old to prison for life. Both sides conducted extensive voir dire, with the prosecution seeking jurors who could focus on the nature of the crime rather than the defendant's age, and the defense seeking jurors who would be troubled by adult prosecution of a child regardless of what he had done. After 5 days of careful questioning, a jury of 7 women and 5 men was seated, along with 4 alternates. Prosecutor Catherine Williams's opening statement balanced the need to acknowledge Zachary's age with the imperative to focus the jury on the brutality of his crime and the evidence of premeditation. "Ladies and gentlemen, when you look at the defendant, you see a child. That's natural. He is only 13 years old. But I ask you to also see the evidence of what he did, why he did it, and how he has responded since. Because what you will learn through the evidence is that Zachary Mitchell may be young in years, but his capacity for calculated violence, his complete lack of empathy, and his sophisticated efforts to avoid responsibility are anything but childlike." Williams displayed a photograph of Sophia Chen smiling in her school picture on the courtroom's large screen. This is Sophia Chen. She was 8 years old when Zachary Mitchell decided to break into her home, assault her, and take her life. Sophia was an honors student, a talented artist, a kind and gentle child who brought joy to everyone who knew her. The evidence will show that Zachary Mitchell stalked Sophia, planned his attack, broke into her home while she was alone, sexually assaulted her, and strangled her to death. Then he took photographs of her body as trophies, went home, and played video games as if nothing had happened. The prosecutor methodically outlined the evidence the jury would see. The physical evidence linking Zachary to the crime scene, the digital evidence showing his research and planning, the photographs on his phone proving his presence in Sophia's bedroom, and his own confession describing what he had done and why. Williams concluded with a direct appeal to look beyond age to actions. The defense will ask you to focus on the defendant's youth and to believe that a 13-year-old cannot truly understand the wrongness of murder. But the evidence will show you a defendant who understood very well what he was doing, who planned it carefully, who executed it brutally, and who has shown absolutely no remorse afterward. Age does not excuse evil, and that is what you will see in this case. Defense attorney Marcus Webb faced the extraordinary challenge of defending a client whose own behavior and statements made him deeply unsympathetic. Webb's opening statement focused entirely on Zachary's age and developmental limitations, largely avoiding discussion of the crime itself since the evidence of guilt was essentially irrefutable. Members of the jury, you are being asked to do something that should trouble every one of us as a society, to treat a 13-year-old child as if he were an adult criminal. Zachary Mitchell is a child. His brain is not fully developed. His capacity for moral reasoning is limited by his developmental stage. His understanding of consequences is impaired by his youth. Webb presented the jury with scientific information about adolescent brain development, explaining that the prefrontal cortex responsible for impulse control and decision-making is not fully mature until the mid-20s. He argued that while what happened to Sophia Chen was a tragedy, the response to that tragedy should not include treating a child as if he were an adult. Yes, a terrible crime was committed. Yes, Sophia Chen's death is a devastating loss. But destroying another child's life by sending him to adult prison for the rest of his life does not honor Sophia's memory or serve justice. It simply creates another victim. The defense's strategy, such as it was, focused on arguing for conviction on lesser charges that might result in juvenile sentencing rather than adult penalties. Webb suggested that the evidence would show impulsive behavior rather than premeditation, that Zachary's actions after the crime reflected confusion and fear rather than callousness, and that his youth required the jury to view everything through a lens of developmental limitation, rather than adult culpability. The prosecution's case unfolded over 2 weeks, with witnesses and evidence creating a comprehensive narrative of planning, brutal execution, and complete absence of remorse. The testimony of Robert and Lynn Chen, describing their daughter's character and the impact of her murder on their family, reduced many in the courtroom to tears. Robert's description of finding Sophia's body, delivered in a voice that broke repeatedly despite his efforts at composure, created powerful emotional testimony about the human cost of Zachary's actions. Lynn Chen's testimony focused on Sophia's last day, describing their morning routine, Sophia's excitement about school, and the normalcy of a day that would end in unfathomable tragedy. I kissed her goodbye that morning and told her I loved her, Lynn testified, tears streaming down her face. She said, "I love you too, Mama," and ran to catch the school bus. That was the last time I saw my baby alive. If I had known, I would have held her longer. I would have told her again how special she was, how proud we were of her, how much joy she brought to our lives. Throughout the Chen family's testimony, Zachary's behavior continued to demonstrate his inability or unwillingness to show appropriate emotion. Court observers noted that he appeared bored during much of their testimony, at one point yawning visibly, and showed no tears or visible distress when Sophia's parents described finding their daughter's body and identifying her at the morgue. This lack of emotional response, while not evidence of guilt in a legal sense, created a powerful impression on jurors who could see the stark contrast between the Chen's obvious anguish and Zachary's apparent indifference. The forensic evidence presentation consumed several days of trial, with experts walking the jury through the crime scene, investigation, the autopsy findings, and the DNA evidence linking Zachary definitively to the crime. Dr. Susan Martinez, the medical examiner who performed Sophia's autopsy, provided clinical testimony about the cause and manner of death that was nonetheless devastating in its implications. Sophia Chen died of asphyxiation due to ligature strangulation, Dr. Martinez testified. The pattern of injuries indicates the strangulation was sustained for several minutes, sufficient time for the perpetrator to observe the victim's distress and suffering, and to make a conscious choice to continue applying pressure until death occurred. The medical examiner also testified about the sexual assault, explaining the injuries documented and the recovery of DNA evidence. This testimony, necessarily graphic despite efforts to minimize disturbing details, created visible distress among jurors and gallery members. Throughout this testimony, Zachary was observed by multiple court personnel to be drawing pictures on his legal pad, appearing to pay minimal attention to the testimony about his victim's suffering and death. The digital forensics testimony provided perhaps the most damning evidence of premeditation and planning. Special Agent Kevin Thompson of the GBI's Computer Crimes Unit walked the jury through Zachary's internet search history, displaying the searches on the courtroom screen and explaining their significance. The progression from general queries about how to get into houses to specific searches about breaking window locks quietly and how long until police find a body told a clear story of planning and preparation incompatible with any claim of impulsive action. Most damaging were the photographs found on Zachary's phone. Agent Thompson explained the technical process of recovering the images that Zachary had attempted to delete, and while the most graphic images were not shown to the jury in open court, redacted versions showing Sophia's bedroom and demonstrating Zachary's presence at the crime scene were displayed. The metadata associated with these images, showing they were taken between 4:15 p.m. and 4:43 p.m. on March 14th, established the timeline of the murder and provided irrefutable proof of Zachary's presence in Sophia's bedroom during the period when she died. When Agent Thompson testified that Zachary had texted one of these images to himself, apparently as a way of preserving it, even if his phone was examined, several jurors appeared visibly disturbed. The implication was clear. This was not a child acting impulsively in a moment of poor judgment, but someone who was thinking ahead, planning to preserve evidence of his crime, and demonstrating a level of calculation that belied any claim of childlike innocence or limitation. The testimony that generated the most visceral reaction in the courtroom came from Mrs. Sarah Thompson, the elderly neighbor who had witnessed Zachary leaving his house on the afternoon of the murder. Mrs. Thompson, who had lived on Maple Street for 50 years and had known multiple generations of neighborhood families, described seeing Zachary walking purposefully toward the wooded area behind the houses at approximately 3:30 p.m. He wasn't just wandering or playing like children do, Mrs. Thompson testified. He was walking with purpose, looking around like he didn't want to be seen. It struck me as odd at the time, but I didn't think much of it until I learned what had happened to poor little Sophia. Mrs. Thompson also testified about Zachary's behavior in the months before the murder, describing how she had noticed him watching Sophia in ways that made her uncomfortable. I saw him several times just standing in his yard or at his window, staring at the Chen house when Sophia was outside. It wasn't like a teenager taking notice of younger neighborhood kids in a normal way. It was intense, focused. I mentioned it to my son when he visited, told him something about that boy wasn't right. I wish I had said something to the Chens, but you don't like to cause trouble with neighbors. The prosecution's presentation of Zachary's confession, via video recording of his interrogation by Agent Simmons, provided the jury with direct access to Zachary's own words describing what he had done and his reasoning. The video ran for approximately 45 minutes, showing selected portions of the multi-hour interrogation. Jurors watched Zachary describe stalking Sophia, breaking into her home, attacking her when she discovered him, and taking photographs afterward. They heard his chilling statement that he didn't feel bad because Sophia was going to tell on me anyway. Perhaps most impactful was the portion of the interrogation where Zachary articulated his belief that his age would protect him from serious consequences. "They can't do anything to me anyway," Zachary had said, smiling at Agent Simmons. "I'm 13. I'll go to juvie for a few years and then I get out when I'm 18 or whatever. It's not like they can send me to real prison." This statement, reflecting Zachary's fundamental miscalculation about the legal system, would be referenced repeatedly during closing arguments as evidence of his consciousness of guilt and his sophisticated understanding that his actions were wrong, even as he believed he would avoid serious punishment. The defense's case, presented over just 3 days, focused entirely on expert testimony about adolescent development and mental health, rather than disputing the facts of the crime. Dr. Jessica Chen, no relation to Sophia's family, a psychologist specializing in juvenile offenders, testified about Zachary's difficult childhood, his exposure to domestic violence and substance abuse in his home, and his diagnosis of conduct disorder. Dr. Chen argued that these factors, combined with his youth, meant Zachary should be viewed as a child whose development had been damaged by circumstances beyond his control, rather than as an inherently evil person. On cross-examination, Prosecutor Williams challenged Dr. Chen's testimony by highlighting that many children experience adverse childhood experiences without becoming murderers. "Dr. Chen, you've testified about Zachary Mitchell's difficult home environment, but you'd agree that thousands of children in Georgia experience similar or worse circumstances and don't commit brutal murders, correct?" Dr. Chen acknowledged this was true. Williams then asked, "And you'd agree that, regardless of his home environment, Zachary Mitchell demonstrated clear understanding that breaking into someone's home and killing them was wrong, correct? He just didn't care because he thought he'd get away with it." Dr. Chen struggled to provide an answer that didn't concede the prosecutor's point. She acknowledged that Zachary understood his actions were legally wrong, though she maintained he had limited capacity to appreciate the moral wrongness of his actions due to his developmental stage and psychological impairment. This distinction between legal and moral understanding, while accurate from a clinical perspective, provided little comfort to jurors who had seen the evidence of Zachary's planning and heard his own words describing his crime. The defense's decision about whether to call Zachary himself to testify generated significant debate within the defense team. Ultimately, recognizing that Zachary's personality and lack of remorse made him an extraordinarily risky witness, Webb decided against calling him to testify. This decision meant jurors would not hear directly from Zachary during trial except through his videotaped confession, perhaps the best possible outcome given his documented inability to demonstrate appropriate emotion or remorse. The closing arguments took place on August 30th, 2023. Prosecutor Williams's closing synthesized the evidence into a powerful narrative of premeditation, brutality, and complete absence of remorse. Ladies and gentlemen, you have seen and heard overwhelming evidence of Zachary Mitchell's guilt. But more than that, you have seen evidence of who he is as a person. He is not a confused child who made a tragic mistake. He is a calculating individual who planned a murder, executed it brutally, and felt no remorse afterward. His age does not change these facts. It does not excuse these facts, and it should not prevent you from holding him fully accountable for these facts. Williams displayed a photograph of Sophia Chen alongside the crime scene photographs, appropriately redacted, that Zachary had taken on his phone. Sophia Chen was 8 years old. She had her whole life ahead of her. Zachary Mitchell took that from her, not in a moment of impulsive, poor judgment, but in a planned attack that he had been thinking about for weeks. He broke into her home. He attacked her. He sexually assaulted her. He strangled her to death. He took photographs of her body. And then he went home and played video games. Does that sound like a child who didn't understand what he was doing? Or does that sound like a predator who understood perfectly well and simply didn't care? The prosecutor concluded with a direct appeal to hold Zachary accountable regardless of his age. The defense will ask you to focus on Zachary Mitchell's youth, and to believe that we cannot expect a 13-year-old to know that rape and murder are wrong. I trust you will reject that insulting premise. Zachary Mitchell knew what he was doing was wrong. He planned it anyway. He executed it brutally. And he has shown no remorse since. Find him guilty of all charges, and allow this court to impose a sentence that protects the community from this dangerous individual. Defense attorney Webb's closing argument represented a final attempt to focus the jury on Zachary's age, rather than his actions. Members of the jury, you are being asked to do something that should trouble all of us: to convict a 13-year-old child of murder and send him to adult prison for the rest of his life. Zachary Mitchell is a child. Yes, he committed terrible acts. Yes, Sophia Chen's death is a devastating tragedy. But Zachary is still a child, and treating him as an adult does not serve justice. It simply continues the cycle of tragedy. Webb acknowledged that the evidence of Zachary's involvement was overwhelming, but argued that the jury should convict him of lesser charges that would allow for juvenile sentencing, rather than adult penalties. You can find Zachary guilty while also recognizing that his youth matters, that his capacity for understanding was limited, and that he deserves a chance at rehabilitation rather than being thrown away at age 13. That's what justice requires in this case. The jury began deliberations on August 31st, 2023, at 2 p.m. Unlike some cases where deliberations stretch for days, the Zachary Mitchell jury reached verdicts on all counts in approximately 6 hours, returning to the courtroom at 8:17 p.m. The relative speed of deliberations suggested jurors found the evidence of guilt overwhelming and spent their time primarily on verdict forms rather than on debating culpability. As the jury filed back into the courtroom, Zachary's demeanor remained remarkably consistent with his behavior throughout trial. He appeared relaxed, even confident, apparently still convinced that nothing truly serious would happen to him. He whispered something to his attorney that prompted Webb to lean in urgently, presumably reminding him to maintain proper courtroom decorum regardless of the verdicts. Judge Foster asked the jury foreman, a middle-aged accountant, if they had reached verdicts. "We have, Your Honor," the foreman replied, handing the verdict forms to the bailiff who delivered them to the judge. Foster reviewed the forms silently before returning them to the clerk for reading. In the matter of State of Georgia versus Zachary Mitchell, on the charge of malice murder in the death of Sophia Chen, we the jury find the defendant guilty. The courtroom remained silent as the verdict was read, the weight of conviction settling over everyone present. In the gallery, Robert and Lynn Chen embraced, their relief at the verdict mingling with the permanent grief of their loss. Zachary's parents, Karen and Dennis Mitchell, both appeared stunned, apparently not having fully grasped until this moment that their son would indeed be held accountable despite his youth. On the charge of felony, murder in the death of Sophia Chen, we the jury find the defendant guilty. On the charge of aggravated child molestation of Sophia Chen, we the jury find the defendant guilty. On the charge of burglary in the first degree, we the jury find the defendant guilty. As each verdict was read, Zachary's confident expression began to fade, replaced first by confusion and then by what appeared to be the first genuine fear he had shown throughout the entire process. He leaned toward his attorney, whispering urgently, presumably asking what this meant and whether he was actually going to prison. Webb's response, whatever it was, clearly did not reassure his client. Judge Foster thanked the jury for their service and set sentencing for September 29, 2023, 1 month after the verdicts, allowing time for preparation of presentence investigation reports and victim impact statements. As the judge explained the sentencing timeline, Zachary's demeanor shifted dramatically from his earlier confident composure. He began shaking his head, tears forming in his eyes for the first time anyone had witnessed during the trial. He turned to look at his mother in the gallery, his expression finally showing something like fear as the reality of his situation began to penetrate his denial. As deputies approached to return Zachary to custody, he stood reluctantly, his earlier swagger completely absent. He was overheard saying to his attorney, loud enough that nearby court personnel heard, "But I'm only 13. They can't really send me to prison, right? Tell them I'm only 13. This statement, pathetic in its demonstration of Zachary's belated recognition that his age would not, in fact, shield him from consequences, captured the core delusion that had characterized his entire approach to his crime and its aftermath. The month between verdict and sentencing proved transformative for Zachary Mitchell in ways that, while perhaps suggesting the beginning of some understanding, came far too late to affect his legal fate. Detention facility reports indicated that he had become withdrawn and tearful, apparently finally grasping that he faced the possibility of life imprisonment. He had requested to speak with a counselor, telling staff that he was starting to understand what I did wrong, and asking if there was any way to fix this. These statements, while potentially indicating the beginning of remorse, or at least fear of consequences, would do little to help Zachary at sentencing. The legal system's machinery had been set in motion by his actions, and his belated recognition of the seriousness of his situation could not undo the planning, the brutality, or the complete lack of remorse he had demonstrated throughout the investigation and trial. The sentencing hearing on September 29, 2023, drew even larger crowds than the trial, with the courthouse implementing additional security measures to manage the overflow. The proceeding began with victim impact statements from Sophia Chen's family, each one devastating in its depiction of loss and its implicit argument for maximum punishment. Robert Chen spoke first, his prepared statement describing the void that Sophia's death had created in their lives. Every morning I wake up and for a moment I forget that Sophia is gone. Then I remember, and it's like losing her all over again. Her bedroom is exactly as she left it that last morning. Her piano sits untouched because neither Lynn nor I can bear to hear music in that house anymore. We moved to Atlanta because we couldn't stay in the house where our daughter was murdered. But we can't escape the grief that follows us everywhere. Robert's statement then addressed Zachary directly, his tone shifting from grief to righteous anger. Zachary Mitchell, you took our daughter from us for no reason other than your own twisted desire to hurt someone. You planned her murder. You broke into our home. You assaulted her. You strangled her while she begged you to stop. You took photographs of her body like she was some trophy. And then you went home and played video games as if you hadn't just destroyed our entire world. You have shown no real remorse, no genuine understanding of what you've done. You deserve to spend the rest of your life in prison. Lin Chen's statement focused on who Sophia had been and what the world lost when Zachary killed her. My daughter was an artist, a musician, a kind and gentle soul who brought light to everyone who knew her. She wanted to be a teacher someday because she loved helping other children learn. She volunteered to help younger students at her school. She saved her allowance to donate to charity. The world is darker because she's gone, and all because this boy decided he wanted to hurt someone, and my Sophia was unlucky enough to be his chosen victim. Additional impact statements came from Sophia's teacher, Mrs. Palmer, who described the impact of her death on her classmates and the school community. Sophia's desk sat empty for weeks because none of her classmates could bear to see someone else sitting in her place. Mrs. Palmer testified through tears. 8-year-olds shouldn't have to learn about murder. They shouldn't have to attend memorial services for their friend. They shouldn't have to be afraid in their own homes because one of their neighbors killed a child their age. Zachary Mitchell didn't just take Sophia's life. He took away these children's innocence and sense of safety. Throughout these victim impact statements, Zachary's demeanor had changed markedly from his confident composure during trial. He sat with his head down, crying quietly, apparently finally feeling something like remorse, or at least fear, as the full weight of his situation crashed down on him. However, this belated emotional response, while perhaps genuine, did little to mitigate the calculated nature of his crime or the lack of remorse he had demonstrated for months after Sophia's death. Defense. Attorney Webb presented a sentencing argument focused entirely on Zachary's youth and the possibility of rehabilitation over decades. Your Honor, Zachary Mitchell is 13 years old. The Supreme Court has recognized that children are different, that their capacity for change is greater, and that even children who commit terrible crimes deserve a chance at redemption. We are not asking for leniency. We are not suggesting that what Zachary did was anything less than horrific. But we are asking this court to recognize that sentencing a 13-year-old to life without parole is essentially giving up on a child, declaring him irredeemable before his brain has even finished developing. Webb presented evidence that Zachary had begun participating in counseling at the detention facility, that he was expressing remorse, however belatedly, and that experts believed he had capacity for growth and change over time. Zachary made the worst decision a human being can make. He took another person's life. But he made that decision at age 13, with a brain that was not fully developed, with limited capacity for understanding long-term consequences, and with significant psychological impairment due to his traumatic home environment. He deserves punishment, but he also deserves a chance, however distant, at eventual freedom if he demonstrates genuine rehabilitation over decades. Prosecutor Williams countered with a forceful argument for life without parole, the maximum sentence available under Georgia law for Zachary's crimes. Your Honor, the defendant sits before you now showing emotion and remorse. But I remind this court that his tears come now, only after being convicted and facing consequences. For months after Sophia Chen's murder, Zachary Mitchell showed no remorse. He bragged about his crime to other detainees. He smiled during a victim impact testimony at trial. He told investigators he didn't feel bad because Sophia was going to tell on him anyway. His tears now are not for Sophia Chen. They are for himself. Williams methodically reviewed the evidence of planning and premeditation, the brutality of the crime, and Zachary's consistent lack of genuine remorse. This was not an impulsive act by a child who didn't understand what he was doing. This was a planned murder by someone who understood perfectly well and simply didn't care. Zachary Mitchell stalked his victim. He researched how to break into homes. He brought tools to facilitate entry. He sexually assaulted an 8-year-old child. He strangled her to death. He took trophy photographs. And he showed no genuine remorse until he was convicted and facing consequences. That is not a child deserving of mercy. That is a predator who must be permanently separated from society. Before announcing sentence, Judge Foster offered Zachary an opportunity to address the court. Zachary, tears streaming down his face, read from a prepared statement that his attorney had clearly helped him craft. I know what I did was wrong. I took Sophia's life and I destroyed her family. I can't undo what I did or bring her back. I'm sorry for what I did to Sophia and to her family. I know I deserve to be punished. I just hope someday I can show that I'm different than I was when I did this terrible thing. This statement, while more appropriate than anything Zachary had said previously, rang hollow given his months of smirking, joking and bragging about his crime. Judge Foster's expression as he listened suggested skepticism about whether this represented genuine remorse or simply a final attempt to avoid maximum punishment. Judge Foster then delivered remarks that would be quoted extensively in media coverage and legal analysis of the case. Zachary Mitchell, you stand convicted of the murder of 8-year-old Sophia Chen, a crime you planned, executed with extreme brutality, and showed no genuine remorse for until you were convicted and facing the consequences of your actions. This court has carefully considered your age, your background, the expert testimony about adolescent development, and the arguments made by your attorney about your capacity for rehabilitation. I have also considered the nature of your crime, your behavior throughout these proceedings, and the assessment of experts that you demonstrate callous, unemotional traits that significantly impair your capacity for the kind of moral development that would make you safe to release in the future. The judge continued, his tone growing more severe as he prepared to pronounce sentence. You were not tried as an adult as some form of arbitrary punishment. You were tried as an adult because the nature of your crime, your level of planning and sophistication, and your complete lack of conscience all demonstrated that you pose a danger that cannot be adequately addressed within the juvenile justice system. Your own words and actions have shown that you view the legal system as an obstacle to outsmart, rather than a mechanism for accountability. Even now, I question whether your tears are for your victim or simply for yourself, as you finally understand that consequences are real. Judge Foster then pronounced sentence, his words shattering Zachary's hope that his age might ultimately save him from maximum punishment. Zachary Mitchell, for the malice murder of Sophia Chen, this court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the felony murder of Sophia Chen, this court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole, to run concurrently with the first count. For aggravated child molestation of Sophia Chen, this court sentences you to 25 years in prison, to run consecutively to the murder sentences. For burglary in the first degree, this court sentences you to 20 years in prison, to run concurrently with the other sentences. The practical effect of these sentences was that Zachary Mitchell would spend the rest of his life in prison with no possibility of parole, the harshest sentence available under Georgia law. Judge Foster concluded his remarks with words that would be replayed countless times in media coverage. You will never be free. You will spend your youth, your middle age, and your elderly years in prison as consequence for the brutal murder of a child. That is what justice requires in this case. As the sentence was pronounced, Zachary's earlier tears transformed into anguished sobs. He turned toward his mother in the gallery, crying, "Mama, please, I'm sorry, please," as deputies approached to take him back into custody. Karen Mitchell, herself sobbing, tried to reach toward her son but was blocked by courtroom security. The scene, while evoking some sympathy for a mother losing her child to imprisonment, did little to change the reality that Zachary had taken another mother's child permanently through murder. As Zachary was led from the courtroom, still crying and calling for his mother, Judge Foster addressed the gallery. This has been an extraordinarily difficult case for everyone involved. A child is dead. Another child will spend his life in prison. These are tragedies that touch all of us. But justice required this outcome, and I trust that this sentence provides some measure of closure for Sophia Chen's family, even though nothing can truly heal the wound of losing a child to violence. The aftermath of Zachary Mitchell's sentencing rippled through multiple communities and renewed national debates about juvenile justice, the age of criminal responsibility, and the appropriate response to children who commit adult crimes. The case became a frequent reference point in discussions about whether any 13-year-old, regardless of their crime, should receive a sentence of life without parole. In Pinehurst, Georgia, the community struggled to process the reality that such violence had emerged from within their midst, and that both victim and perpetrator were children. Sophia's death and Zachary's sentencing became a catalyst for enhanced attention to child safety, mental health resources in schools, and early identification of troubled youth before their dysfunction escalated to violence. The county school system implemented mandatory training for all staff in recognizing warning signs of conduct disorder and psychopathic traits in children, attempting to ensure future cases might be identified and addressed before tragedy occurred. The Sophia Chen Memorial Foundation was established by her parents, providing funding for arts education programs and scholarships for students pursuing teaching careers in elementary education. The Foundation's mission statement emphasized that Sophia's legacy should be one of creativity, kindness, and dedication to helping others, rather than being defined solely by the violence that ended her life. The Foundation's annual fundraiser became a major community event, bringing together Pinehurst residents in shared commitment to honoring Sophia's memory through positive action. For Robert and Lynn Chen, life after sentencing meant learning to carry grief that would never fully heal while finding ways to honor their daughter's memory and build new meaning from devastating loss. Robert eventually left teaching, finding that being around children Sophia's age was too painful a reminder of what he had lost. He transitioned to educational administration, working on curriculum development, where he could impact children's learning without the constant emotional trigger of classroom teaching. Lynn continued her nursing work, finding that caring for patients provided some sense of purpose and connection during her darkest times. The couple remained in Atlanta, unable to return to Pinehurst, where every street corner held memories of Sophia, and where the house that had been their home became forever associated with her murder. They eventually had another child, a daughter born in 2025, whom they named Hope, a name they chose deliberately to reflect their determination to find light even in darkness. Hope's existence did not replace Sophia or diminish their grief, but provided them with renewed purpose and connection to life beyond their loss. Karen and Dennis Mitchell's lives were permanently altered by their son's actions and the recognition of their own failures as parents. Their marriage did not survive the stress, ending in divorce within a year of Zachary's sentencing. Dennis descended further into alcoholism and died in 2019 from liver failure, his death certificate listing alcohol-related liver disease as cause but understood by those who knew the family to be partially attributable to the grief and guilt of having raised a child capable of murder. Karen struggled with depression and addiction, cycling through treatment programs while living on disability payments, forever haunted by questions about what she could have done differently to prevent her son from becoming a murderer. Neither parent maintained contact with Zachary after his sentencing, with Karen later explaining through a social worker that seeing her son in prison was too painful and that she blamed herself for his actions. This abandonment, while understandable given the circumstances, meant Zachary entered the Georgia prison system at age 13 completely alone, without family support or connection to anyone from his life before incarceration. Zachary's transition from juvenile detention to adult prison occurred on his 14th birthday, as Georgia law required that juveniles convicted as adults be transferred to adult facilities once they reached 14. The transfer to Coastal State Prison, a medium security facility in southeast Georgia that housed a separate unit for young offenders in adult custody, marked the beginning of what would be Zachary's permanent existence behind bars. Prison psychological evaluations during his first years of incarceration continued to document significant personality pathology and limited progress in developing empathy or genuine remorse. Dr. Michael Torres, the prison psychologist who worked with Zachary during his first 2 years at Coastal State Prison, noted in his reports, the inmate continues to demonstrate primarily self-focused emotional responses. When discussing his crime, he focuses almost entirely on how it has affected his own life, rather than on the harm inflicted on his victim. When expressing remorse, it appears performative rather than genuine, calculated to improve his status within the institution rather than reflecting authentic moral development. However, by his late teens, prison records began to show some subtle shifts that suggested possible psychological evolution. Zachary completed his GED and began taking college courses through correspondence programs. He participated more consistently in therapy sessions and group programs focused on violence prevention and empathy development. Counselors noted that he had begun, tentatively, to express some genuine understanding of the harm he had caused, though whether this represented authentic growth or simply more sophisticated manipulation remained subject to debate among the professionals who worked with him. In a prison interview conducted in 2028, when Zachary was 18 years old, he discussed his crime and sentencing for the first time publicly. I was 13 when I killed Sophia Chen. I'm 18 now. I spent the last 5 years in prison thinking about what I did and trying to understand why I did it. I can't undo it. I can't bring her back. I deserve to be here. I just wish I could have understood then what I understand now. That she was a real person with a family who loved her. That taking her life meant destroying her parents and everyone who cared about her. I was too focused on what I wanted to think about anyone else. This interview, published in a criminal justice journal, generated mixed reactions. Some viewed Zachary's statements as evidence of genuine growth and questioned whether life without parole for a 13-year-old could ever be just, regardless of his crime. Others saw his comments as calculated manipulation designed to build public support for future clemency efforts, pointing out that his expressions of remorse came only after years in prison and after exhausting all appeals rather than emerging spontaneously from genuine moral awakening. The legal aftermath of Zachary's case included multiple appeals challenging both his conviction and sentence. His appellate attorneys argued that life without parole for a 13-year-old violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment, that his confession should have been suppressed due to his age and limited understanding, and that trying him as an adult had violated his rights to juvenile court jurisdiction. The Georgia Court of Appeals rejected all these arguments in 2025, and the Georgia Supreme Court declined to review the case in 2026, leaving Zachary's conviction and sentence intact. A final attempt to seek relief through federal habeas corpus proceedings was filed in 2007, arguing that recent Supreme Court decisions regarding juvenile sentencing required reconsideration of Zachary's life without parole sentence. The federal district court denied relief, finding that while the Supreme Court had limited life without parole for juveniles in some contexts, it had not eliminated the sentence entirely, and that Zachary's case involved the kind of rare, heinous crime where such a sentence remained constitutionally permissible, even for young offenders. This decision was affirmed by the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals in 2029, effectively ending Zachary's legal challenges. By 2030, Zachary Mitchell had spent 7 years in adult prison, transforming from a 13-year-old boy into a 20-year-old man who had spent his entire adolescence incarcerated. Prison records described him as a compliant inmate who avoided disciplinary infractions, participated in available programming, and maintained minimal contact with the outside world beyond occasional correspondence with a prison ministry volunteer, who served as his only regular connection to anyone outside prison walls. Whether Zachary would ever be released from prison remained, barring commutation or pardon, entirely academic. His life without a parole sentence meant he would die in prison absent extraordinary intervention from Georgia's governor or the courts. Any future governor considering clemency would have to confront extensive documentation of Zachary's crime, his lack of remorse during trial, and the expert assessments questioning his capacity for genuine rehabilitation. The practical reality was that Zachary Mitchell would spend his entire life in custody, his existence serving as both punishment for his crime and protection for potential future victims. What remained clear was that March 14, 2023 had destroyed multiple lives and created ripples that would extend far into the future. Sophia Chen would never grow up, never fulfill her potential, never experience the countless joys and sorrows that constitute a complete life. Her parents would carry their grief permanently, navigating a world permanently diminished by her absence. Zachary Mitchell would spend his youth, middle age, and eventual elderly years in prison, his life defined entirely by a decision he made at age 13 to break into a neighbor's home and kill an 8-year-old child. The case raised profound questions about childhood evil, criminal responsibility, and whether any 13-year-old can be so broken that life imprisonment without possibility of release is the only just response. Different observers would answer these questions differently based on their values, their understanding of child development, and their beliefs about punishment versus rehabilitation. But for those directly affected, the Chen family, the Pinehurst community, and ultimately Zachary Mitchell himself, these philosophical debates provided little comfort against the concrete reality of loss, grief, and permanent consequence. Judge Foster's words at sentencing echoed beyond that courtroom, becoming a touchstone in debates about juvenile justice. You will never be free. For Zachary Mitchell, who had smiled his way through trial convinced that his age would shield him from serious punishment, those words represented the shattering of a delusion and the beginning of a lifetime of consequence. For Sophia Chen's family, those words represented a form of justice that could never restore what was lost, but that at least ensured their daughter's killer would never have the freedom she would never experience. The courthouse in Vienna, Georgia, where Judge Foster pronounced sentence, has since handled countless other cases, most far less serious and emotionally wrenching. But the case of Zachary Mitchell remains present in the collective memory of everyone who participated in those proceedings, a reminder of the darkness that can exist even in children, and the impossible decisions the justice system must sometimes make about how to respond to evil when it emerges from the young.